You're dead now. That's what the police will think. That's what my son will think. Leave!
He had not been back in 8 years. The gate was the same. The gravel driveway was the same, overgrown at the edges, a little narrower than he remembered, the way things that are not tended slowly shrink back into the earth. The oak trees on either side had grown taller and their branches had reached toward each other across the driveway until they were almost touching overhead, the way they had always been reaching when he was a boy, and the reaching had never quite gotten there. Mike Hargrove pulled his Range Rover to a stop in front of the house and sat for a moment with the engine running. He was 42 years old. He had a penthouse in Nashville, a second home in Aspen, a company worth $800 million, and a view from his office window that people called stunning and that he had stopped seeing sometime around year 4 because views stop being views when you stop having someone to say look at that to. He had come back for one reason. The developer wanted the property, the price was fair, and there was nothing left here that Mike needed to keep. He had arranged for his assistant to meet him with the paperwork at noon. He had planned to sign and be back in Nashville by 2. He got out of the car. The November air was cold and still. His breath made small clouds. The house sat at the end of the driveway exactly as it always had, a white farmhouse, 2 stories, the paint peeling at the corners where the wood had started to separate, the porch railing on the left side leaning at the angle it had been leaning since 1987 when his uncle backed a truck into it and nobody ever fixed it because some things just become part of a house over time. He was almost at the porch steps when he stopped. The lights were on inside. Not just one light. The kitchen light. The hallway light. The warm yellow rectangle of the window to the left of the door where the living room had been when he was 12 and his mother had put a chair there that nobody was allowed to sit in because it was decorative, whatever that meant to a 12-year-old. Mike stood on the gravel driveway and looked at the lit windows of a house that was supposed to be empty. He went up the porch steps. He reached for the door handle. He pushed it open. And standing at the kitchen counter, 8 years older, with a dish towel in her hands and her hair a little shorter than he remembered and her eyes the same specific gray-green he had spent 8 years trying to forget because forgetting had been the only way to get through a day, was Evelyn. His wife. Who had been dead since the 3rd of November, 8 years ago, when her car went off Route 12 and caught fire in the ravine below the road and the police had called him at 9 in the evening and told him there were no survivors and the identification had been confirmed by personal effects. Evelyn. Alive. Standing in his kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. She saw him and the color left her face in an instant, not slowly, not gradually, but immediately, the way color leaves a face when the thing it is seeing is the thing it was most afraid of seeing. She stepped backward. Her hands found the edge of the counter behind her. The dish towel dropped. Mike could not speak. Could not move. Could not process the information his eyes were sending him because the information did not fit inside any category his brain had available for it. And then a boy walked in from the hallway. 8 years old. Dark hair. A red t-shirt with a number 7 on it. He was carrying a book and he was looking down at it as he walked and he did not notice Mike immediately because he was reading the last line of something and finishing a sentence before looking up is a very specific habit, and Mike recognized it immediately because it was his habit, had been his habit since he was a child, and he had never once in his life met another person who did that. The boy looked up. His eyes were green. Not gray-green like his mother's. Green. The particular shade of green that Mike had seen every morning of his life in the mirror above the bathroom sink and had never thought about once because you do not think about the color of your own eyes until you are standing in a kitchen you have not entered in 8 years looking at an 8-year-old boy who is looking back at you with them. Mike's hands started shaking. He could not have explained why. His brain had not yet assembled the full sentence. But his body already knew. His body already knew. Evelyn stepped in front of the boy. Fast, deliberate, the step of someone who has been rehearsing this moment in case it ever came. She looked at Mike, not with the joy of someone seeing a person they loved, not even with the grief of someone seeing a person they lost. With the specific, steady, contained anger of someone who has been carrying something for 8 years and has decided that today is the day it gets put down. She said, You believed everything she told you. You never once questioned it. Then she pushed the door closed. Mike stood on the porch in the cold dark with the sound of the latch clicking behind him and 8 years of his life rearranged on the other side of a door he did not know how to knock on. Now. Before I take you inside that house. Before I tell you who that boy is and what Evelyn has been carrying and what actually happened on the 3rd of November 8 years ago, I need you to understand something. This story does not start with Mike. It starts with a woman who was given $1,000 and told she was dead, and who took that $1,000 and built a life anyway. And when you understand what she built, and what she built it from, everything that happens in that house is going to hit you in a place words don't usually reach. And here is the question I need you sitting with right now: what kind of person engineers the death of a pregnant woman to protect a family name? And what happens when that same woman is standing in the room 8 years later with the evidence? Stay with me. Because the answer to both of those questions is coming. And neither of them will go the way you are expecting. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit the bell. This is the kind of story you do not want to find out you missed halfway through. Hit subscribe, stay close, and let's go back to where this actually started. Because the truth begins 8 years before Mike's hand started shaking on that driveway. There was a mason jar on the counter in Evelyn's kitchen with $43 in it. Not $43 until next week. $43 total. The jar had a piece of masking tape on the side with the word rent written on it in black marker, and the rent was $600, and it was due in 6 days, and Evelyn was not worried about it in the way that people who have never had $43 in a jar think worried looks. She was working the problem. She had already moved the math around in her head 100 times that week, fitting the numbers together the way you fit a puzzle where the pieces never quite make the full picture. 2 bowls on the shelf. 2 cups. 2 spoons in the drawer. 1 big, 1 small. A math test on the refrigerator door held with a magnet shaped like the state of Tennessee. Lucas Hargrove, she had given him his father's name, quietly, without fanfare, because it was his name and it always would be no matter what anyone had done to separate them. At the top of the test, in red ink, 95%. 1 thin blanket folded on the couch because the bedroom only had one and Lucas got cold at night and Evelyn did not. Clean floors. Every room. Not because they had much, they had almost nothing, the furniture was secondhand and mismatched and the walls still had the faint outlines where pictures had hung before she arrived, but because clean is the one thing you can control when everything else is outside your control, and Evelyn had understood this for 8 years. She worked days at a grocery store on Route 9, stocking shelves from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., wearing a green vest with her name on it in white letters. She worked evenings cleaning offices in a building downtown, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, starting at 6 p.m. and finishing close to midnight. On the nights she worked, Lucas stayed with a neighbor named Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher who had never asked Evelyn a single question about where she'd come from or why she was here, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for her in 8 years. She made it work. Not comfortably, not without calculation, not without the specific daily arithmetic of a person who knows exactly how much things cost and exactly how much they have and exactly how thin the margin between those two numbers is. But she made it work. She had made it work for 8 years. And none of it, not the 2 bowls, not the 95% on the refrigerator, not the $43 in the jar, none of it was because of luck or coincidence or the world being generous. It was because Evelyn Brooks Hargrove was the specific kind of person who, when the world removes everything from under her, finds the floor anyway and stands on it. You need to know that. You need to hold that when the rest of this story comes. Now go back 8 years further. Go back to when Evelyn was 27 and married to Mike Hargrove and genuinely, unreservedly happy in the way that people are happy when they have found the person they were supposed to find and the life they were supposed to live and they know it and it feels as good as they always hoped it would feel. Mike was 34. He had built his company from a single software contract into a regional technology firm that was beginning to attract serious outside attention. He worked long hours and he worried about the right things and he brought Evelyn coffee in the mornings without being asked because he had noticed early on that she did not fully exist before the first cup and he found that endearing rather than inconvenient. They lived in a house in East Nashville with a porch they used and a kitchen they cooked in and a life that was theirs, built by them, belonging to nobody else. And then Evelyn took a test on a Tuesday morning in April and sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time and then walked to the kitchen where Mike was reading the news and said his name once. He looked up. She showed him the test. He was quiet for 3 seconds and then he stood up and picked her up and she laughed the way you laugh when you are surprised by the size of your own happiness, and they stood in the kitchen holding each other and neither of them said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that the holding wasn't already saying. That is the 30 seconds of uncomplicated happiness I am giving you before everything changes. Hold on to it. Because what comes next will try to take it from you, and it is important that you remember it was real. Margaret Hargrove found out 3 days later. Mike had called her, of course he had called her, she was his mother, he told her everything, that was the dynamic that had been in place his entire life and he had never examined it closely enough to understand what it was built on. He called her from the kitchen while Evelyn was in the other room and his voice was the voice of a man who was genuinely, unguardedly happy. Margaret listened. Said the right things. Congratulations. How wonderful. You must be so excited. Then she put the phone down. Margaret Hargrove was 68 years old. She had spent 40 years accumulating two things simultaneously, money and control. The money was Mike's father's, left to her when he died of a heart attack 14 years ago, and she had grown it with a focused attention that her financial advisors found impressive and her family found quietly terrifying. The control was harder to see from the outside because Margaret had mastered the art of control that disguises itself as love. She had opinions about everything in Mike's life, his friends, his employees, his apartment, his choices, and she delivered those opinions in a voice of patient concern, always framed as wanting what was best for him, always arriving at the conclusion that what was best for him was what Margaret had already decided. She had not liked Evelyn from the beginning. Evelyn was not from the right family. Did not come with the right connections. Had her own opinions, which she expressed clearly, which Margaret had recognized immediately as the most dangerous quality a person could have in proximity to her son. For 2 years, Margaret had worked steadily to undermine the marriage, comments dressed as concern, observations wrapped in the language of love, a slow and patient campaign of erosion that Evelyn had felt and named and that Mike had consistently explained away because the alternative, that his mother was deliberately, methodically trying to destroy his marriage, was too uncomfortable to fully accept. The pregnancy changed the calculation entirely. A child was not a wife who could be divorced. A child was permanent. A child with Mike's name would inherit what Margaret had spent 40 years building and protecting, and that child's mother would have a seat at the table Margaret had never intended to offer her. Margaret had given herself 3 days to decide what to do. On the 4th day, she called Evelyn and asked her to come for lunch. Evelyn arrived at Margaret's estate in Brentwood at noon. They ate in the dining room with the good china that came out only when Margaret wanted someone to understand exactly how much of everything she had. Over the second course, Margaret set a white envelope on the table and pushed it across to Evelyn. $200,000. A wire transfer, ready to execute. Evelyn would leave. She would not contact Mike. She would not contact anyone in the Hargrove family. She would receive the money and she would disappear and the story would be whatever Margaret decided the story would be. Evelyn picked up the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it back on the table and pushed it toward Margaret. And here is where I need you to pause for just a second and ask yourself, what would you have done? 4 months pregnant. Alone in that dining room with that woman and that envelope. What would you have done? Because what Evelyn did next is the reason this story exists. Margaret's face did not change. Not a flicker. Not a flinch. She looked at the envelope sitting between them and she looked at Evelyn and she said, in the voice she reserved for things that had been decided and were no longer open for discussion. I gave you a chance to leave with dignity. You refused. Now we do this the hard way. Evelyn did not know what that meant. She found out 3 weeks later. The knock came at 2 a.m. Evelyn was asleep. She was 4 months pregnant, and the first trimester exhaustion had finally lifted into the specific deep sleep of someone whose body is busy with something enormous and has redirected every available resource toward it. She had been asleep since 10. She had been having a good dream, she could not remember it afterward, only that it was good, only that she had been warm in it. The knock was not soft. It was the knock of someone who did not care whether you were asleep. She opened the door to a man she had never seen before. Mid-40s. A gray jacket. Careful eyes that were not unkind but were not warm either, the eyes of someone doing a job, trying to do it cleanly, not entirely comfortable with what the job required. His name was Ray Cooper. She would not know that for 8 years. He told her she had 1 hour to pack one bag. He told her that if she did not, Mike would receive a package the following morning containing photographs, documents, and phone records that had been fabricated, carefully, expensively fabricated, which would demonstrate, conclusively and without apparent room for doubt, that Evelyn had been having an affair for the past 14 months. He told her that the documentation was thorough enough that no lawyer she could afford would be able to disprove it quickly enough to matter. He told her that she would lose Mike. She would lose the house. And she would lose custody of the child, because the documentation also contained a psychological evaluation, commissioned privately, that raised serious questions about her fitness as a parent. He said all of this in a level voice, standing in her doorway at 2 a.m., without pleasure and without apology. Evelyn stood in the doorway of her own home and looked at this man, and she understood, with the complete, terrible clarity of someone whose worst fear has just been confirmed, that Margaret had not been bluffing. That the woman who had pushed the envelope back across the table 3 weeks ago had not been angry or surprised. She had been calculating. She had always been calculating. Evelyn packed one bag. She packed the things that couldn't be replaced, 3 photographs, her grandmother's ring, the journal she'd kept since college. She packed 2 changes of clothes. She left everything else exactly where it was because there was no time, and because on some level she understood that she was leaving a version of her life behind and the things in it belonged to that version. She picked up her purse. She walked out her front door. She got in Ray Cooper's car without looking back, because looking back was not something she could afford at 2 a.m. with one bag and everything she had ever built disappearing behind her. The car drove for 40 minutes. It did not go to a bus station. It stopped at the edge of a field on the outskirts of Memphis, on a road with no streetlights, with the November sky overhead and the cold coming through the car windows and nothing ahead of her but dark. Another car was already there. Margaret stepped out of it. She was immaculate, as always. Coat buttoned. Hair perfect. The specific composed elegance of a woman who had dressed carefully for something she had planned carefully, because attention to detail was Margaret Hargrove's love language and her weapon simultaneously. She stood in front of Evelyn in a field in the dark at 3 a.m. and she said what she had come to say. "This is over. Your name, your story, your place in my son's life, all of it is over as of tonight. In approximately 2 hours, a car registered in your name will be found burning in a ravine on Route 12. Your identification will be confirmed by personal effects that were placed inside it before it was set on fire. The police will call my son in the morning. There will be a funeral. And you will not be at it. You will not be anywhere near it. You will not contact Mike. You will not contact anyone who knows Mike. You will take the money in that envelope and you will disappear completely and permanently, and if you ever, attempt to come back, I will not be standing in a field having a conversation. Do you understand me?" Evelyn looked at her. She said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. Because she was 4 months pregnant and alone in a field at 3 a.m. with one bag and no phone signal and a woman in front of her who had just demonstrated, with complete and methodical calm, that she was capable of anything. Margaret held out an envelope. Evelyn took it. The car pulled away. She stood in the field in the dark and opened the envelope with hands that were shaking not from cold but from the specific full-body shock of a person who has just had their entire life surgically removed. $1,000. That was the number Margaret Hargrove had assigned to Evelyn's silence. To 8 years of her life. To the erasure of her name and her marriage and her place in the world. $1,000. She stood in the field in the dark with $1,000 in an envelope and a baby she was 4 months from meeting, and she did two things. She cried. She let herself do that, briefly, privately, in the way that she would cry for the rest of her life, quickly, completely, and then done. And then she picked up the bag. She walked toward the distant lights of a gas station half a mile down the road. And she started doing what she would do for the next 8 years. She started making it work. Across the city, at that same moment, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville, Mike Hargrove was reading a contract when his phone rang. He did not recognize the number. He answered it anyway because he always answered numbers he didn't recognize. You miss things if you don't. The voice on the other end was a police officer. Her voice was careful and practiced in the way that voices are practiced when they deliver this particular kind of news regularly and have learned that careful and direct is a kindness. She told him there had been an accident on Route 12. A car had gone off the road and caught fire in the ravine below. The car was registered to an Evelyn Hargrove. Identification had been confirmed by personal effects found at the scene. There were no survivors. Mike's hand went still on his desk. The contract was still in his other hand. He did not put it down. He sat very still with the contract in one hand and the phone in the other, and the officer's voice continuing, asking if there was someone who could be with him, asking if he needed the address of the responding station, asking questions he heard but could not process because the processing part of him had stopped. He sat at his desk for 4 hours after the call ended. Someone brought him water. He drank it without knowing he was drinking it. His hands never fully stopped shaking that night. Think about that for a moment. The same night. Evelyn standing in a field with $1,000. Mike sitting at a desk with a phone in his hand. Two people. One lie. Destroying both of them from opposite sides simultaneously. And somewhere between those two people, a child who had not yet been born and had no idea what had already been taken from him. Keep watching. Because what happens next, the part Margaret never planned for, is the part that changes everything. Evelyn reached Louisville 6 days later on a bus she paid for with cash from the envelope. She found a room in a boarding house for $180 a month. She got a job at a laundromat. She did not use her real name. She told people her name was Ellen, just Ellen, and most people in that building did not ask for more than that because most people in that building were also just first names and not much else. She gave birth alone in a county hospital on the 14th of January. The nurse who helped her was a woman named Diane who had been doing this for 26 years and who recognized, without being told anything, that this woman was alone in a way that was not normal and that what this woman needed was for someone to be steady and present and ask nothing. Diane was steady and present and asked nothing. Evelyn named the baby Lucas. She added Hargrove on the birth certificate in the spot for the father's last name and left the father's information blank because she did not know how to fill it in and because it was the only thing she had left to give him. She spent 2 years in Louisville. 2 years in Cincinnati. A year in Knoxville. And then, slowly, carefully, she made her way back to Tennessee, because Tennessee was where she was from and because the only place she had ever felt safe was a white farmhouse outside of town that belonged to the Hargrove family and that Margaret had never cared about because it was old and small and held no social currency, which meant it was the one place Margaret would never think to look. She had been back for 7 years. She had been hiding in the one place she thought was safe. And then one afternoon in November, she heard a car she recognized pulling up the gravel driveway. Mike sat in his car for a long time after the door closed. He sat there until the kitchen light went off and then came on again in a different window, the living room, he thought, or what used to be the living room, and he watched the light move through the house the way people move through a house they live in, familiar and unhurried, and he thought about the 8 years between the phone call on Route 12 and this moment, and he thought about the boy's eyes. He did not drive away. He came back at 7 the next morning. He knocked. He waited. He heard movement inside and then stillness and then more movement and then the door opened and Evelyn was standing there in the doorway in the cold morning light, and she looked at him the way you look at someone you have been preparing yourself to look at for a long time, not surprised, not soft, just ready. She let him in. Not because she had forgiven him. Not because she trusted him. Because the boy had a right to the truth and she was done building a life on things that had been decided by other people without her consent. They sat at the kitchen table. Lucas was at school. The house was quiet. Evelyn told him everything. She told it in order, specifically, without dramatizing any of it because the facts themselves were dramatic enough and dramatizing them would have felt like reaching for something she did not need. She told him about the lunch with the white envelope. She told him about Ray Cooper at 2 a.m. She told him about the field outside Memphis and the other car already waiting and Margaret standing in front of her, immaculate. She told him about Ray Cooper at 2 a.m. She told him about the field outside Memphis and the other car already waiting and Margaret standing in front of her, immaculate, at 3 a.m., with everything already decided. She told him about the $1,000. She told him word for word what Margaret had said. Mike listened without speaking. His hands were flat on the table. His face was the face of a man assembling something and not liking the shape it was taking. When Evelyn finished, there was a long silence. Then she said the thing he had no answer for. You attended a closed coffin funeral. Your mother told you the fire made identification difficult. You accepted that without a question. You never asked to see a medical examiner's report. You never asked why the funeral was closed. You never asked to speak to the officer who called you that night. You never questioned a single thing she told you, about me, about my character, about any of it, not in 7 years of marriage and not in 8 years of grief. I knew that she would do something. I told you twice, not in those exact words, but I told you. And you explained it away. Both times. She was not angry when she said it. She was past angry. She was at the specific place past anger where everything is just true. Mike could not argue with a single word of it. Because she was right. And the reason she was right was the thing he had spent 8 years not examining, that he had trusted his mother's version of everything, including Evelyn, including their marriage, in the specific way that people trust the stories they were handed before they were old enough to ask for evidence. He had not questioned it. He had loved Evelyn. He had genuinely loved her. And even that had not been enough to make him question it. Now, before this story moves to what Mike did next, I want to ask you something in the comments below, and I genuinely want to hear your answer. Has someone you trusted ever used that trust against you? Not a stranger. Someone close. Someone whose version of events you accepted because questioning it felt like a betrayal of the relationship itself. Drop your answer below. Because what Mike is sitting with at that kitchen table is something this audience knows. And you deserve to have it named. He drove to his mother's house at 10 that morning. Margaret's estate in Brentwood was exactly as it had always been, the long driveway, the manicured grounds, the house itself enormous and white and perfectly maintained, a building designed specifically to communicate permanence and authority to anyone approaching it. Mike had been coming up this driveway his entire life. He had never once felt what he felt coming up it now. Margaret opened the door herself. She looked at her son's face and she read it accurately in about 2 seconds. She had always been able to read Mike's face, it was one of the tools she had used most reliably for 40 years, and she stepped back and let him in. They stood in the foyer. Mike told her what he had found. He told her where he had been that morning. He told her what Evelyn had said. And Margaret listened to all of it and then she said, in the same level voice she used for everything that had already been decided, looking directly at her son without flinching or softening or reaching for anything that looked like remorse. I don't regret it. Not one decision, not one moment. I protected you and I protected this family's legacy from a woman who was not who you thought she was and who would have taken everything your father and I built and handed it to people who had no claim to it. I did what any good mother would have done. She said it the way you say something you have said to yourself many times in private and have completely made your peace with. Mike looked at his mother for a long moment. He had come here with some remaining doubt, some thread of the story that might unravel into something more explainable, something less monstrous. He had come here still hoping, on some level he would not have admitted, that there was a version of this that he could live inside without the full weight of what it was. Margaret had just removed that option. I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. Before Mike could speak, Margaret reached for her phone. She made one call. In less than a minute, her attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had been on retainer for 15 years and who had made a great deal of money being available for exactly these moments, was informed that Mike was on the property and that she would require documentation protecting her interests immediately. As Mike walked out the front door, his phone rang. Gerald Whitmore's office. The message was brief. A restraining order application was being filed. Any further contact with Margaret Hargrove or her property would be addressed through legal channels. His access to the family trust, which contained a significant portion of his operational liquidity, was being reviewed. Mike sat in his car in his mother's driveway and understood that he had approximately an hour before this became a legal situation complicated enough to delay everything. There was one person who might have what he needed. A man named Gerald Brooks. Evelyn's father. A retired high school history teacher who lived in a small house in Murfreesboro and who had never trusted Margaret Hargrove and had said so, once, directly, to Mike's face at Thanksgiving 6 years into the marriage, and whom Mike had not spoken to in 3 years because the grief of maintaining that connection had eventually become more than Mike knew how to carry. Gerald had always believed something was wrong about the way Evelyn died. Mike had never asked him why. He was asking now. And what Gerald had been keeping in a manila folder for 8 years, what he had never thrown away because some things stay with you until the moment they make sense, was about to change everything. Gerald Brooks opened the door before Mike had finished knocking. He was 71 years old. A little thinner than Mike remembered. The same careful eyes that Evelyn had, the eyes of someone who watches things closely and processes what they see slowly and accurately. He was holding a mug of coffee and he looked at Mike for a long moment with an expression that was not surprise. I knew she wasn't dead, Gerald said. I could never prove it. Come inside. They sat at Gerald's kitchen table. The house was small and warm and full of books, the specific density of books that accumulates over a lifetime of teaching history and never throwing anything away. Gerald set his coffee down and went to the back of the house and came back with a manila folder that had been handled enough that the edges were soft. He had kept it for 8 years. Not because he had planned to use it. Because he had not been able to throw it away. He opened it on the table. The first thing was a copy of the police report. Gerald had requested it 3 months after the funeral, quietly, without telling anyone, because there was something about the closed coffin and the careful timing and the way Margaret had managed every aspect of the funeral arrangements with an efficiency that felt less like grief and more like logistics. And Gerald was a man who had spent 30 years teaching students to notice the difference between what a document says and what a document means. The police report listed the identification of the deceased as confirmed by personal effects. Not by dental records. Not by any biological confirmation. By personal effects placed inside a burning vehicle. Gerald had circled this in pencil 8 years ago and the circle was still there. The second thing was a bank record. Evelyn had given Gerald access to her personal account years earlier, for emergencies, she'd said. 2 days before the fire, there was a wire transfer out of Evelyn's account for the exact amount of $300. The amount Ray Cooper had given her for bus fare. The amount that had no explanation in any version of the story Margaret had told. The third thing was a note card in Margaret's handwriting that had arrived tucked inside a sympathy arrangement 3 days after the funeral. The front said the standard things. Gerald had turned it over and on the back, in the same handwriting, were 4 words that had no reason to be on a sympathy card. Everything is as planned. Gerald had not known what it meant when he received it. He had kept it because it bothered him. He had kept it for 8 years in a manila folder with a circled police report and a bank record because some things stay with you until the moment they make sense. They made sense now. Mike looked at the 3 items on the table. The circled police report. The $300 wire transfer 2 days before the fire. The note card with 4 words in his mother's handwriting. He reached into his jacket for his phone. Gerald said, "There's something else." He got up and went to the hallway and came back with a second folder, newer, the edges still sharp. He set it on the table. Inside was a property deed. A holding company called Hargrove Legacy Group LLC had purchased a storage unit in Memphis on the same week that Evelyn had disappeared. The registered agent for Hargrove Legacy Group LLC was Patricia N. Hargrove, Margaret's full legal name. And behind the property deed was a printed email chain. 7 emails. Margaret's personal account on one side. An untraceable Gmail address on the other. References to the arrangement. References to permanent resolution. References to when she's been processed. And in the final email, a single line from Margaret's account, confirm when it's done. Destroy this chain. The Gmail account had replied, confirmed. Done. Gerald had never destroyed anything. Are you beginning to see what Mike is holding right now? A bank transfer. An email chain. A property deed. A sympathy note card with 4 words in his mother's handwriting. Every piece of it specific. Every piece of it traceable. Margaret had been meticulous about executing the plan and completely certain she would never be in a room where the evidence was laid out in front of her. She had miscalculated one thing. Gerald Brooks never threw anything away. Mike stared at the email chain for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and dialed the number listed in a reply email as a callback number. It rang twice. A man answered. His voice was the voice of someone who had been expecting a call for a long time and had made peace with the fact that it was coming. Ray Cooper, Mike said. Not a question. A pause. Then, yeah. Ray Cooper was 53 years old and still in Nashville and had not slept a full night since the 3rd of November 8 years ago. He did not say that to Mike, but Mike heard it in the quality of his voice, the particular tiredness of a man who has been carrying something so long it has become part of his posture. Mike told him what he had. Every piece. Ray Cooper listened. When Mike finished, Ray Cooper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I needed money. My daughter was sick. I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm just telling you because you deserve the whole truth. He told Mike everything. The field outside Memphis. Margaret's exact words. The $1,000 in the envelope. The car already waiting with Evelyn's jacket inside, her wallet, the bracelet Mike had given her on their first anniversary. And then one detail that only someone who was there could know. She had a second envelope, Ray Cooper said. Thicker than the first one. She had it in her coat when she got out of the car. She looked at it for a second when the girl got out. Then she put it back in her pocket. I don't know what was in it. But she put it back. Mike understood what was in it. The story she would have told Mike if he had ever asked. The backup documentation. The prepared explanation. The envelope she never needed to use because he never asked. He ended the call. He looked at Gerald across the table. Tomorrow morning, Mike said. Gerald closed the folder. I'll be ready. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because what happens tomorrow morning at Margaret Hargrove's door is the part of this story that nobody walks away from unchanged. Hit that subscribe button, hit the bell, and do not go anywhere. They arrived at Margaret Hargrove's estate at 9 in the morning. 4 of them. Mike. Evelyn. Gerald. And Ray Cooper, who had driven himself in his own car and who stood slightly apart from the others on the driveway with the contained, still posture of someone who is doing the hardest thing they have done in a long time and is doing it anyway. Margaret opened the door herself. She looked at the 4 of them standing on her front steps. Something crossed her face in the space between recognizing who was there and deciding how to respond to it, something that was not quite panic, something more controlled than panic, something that looked more like a very fast and very precise recalculation of position. Then the composure mask returned, complete and seamless, the way it always returned, and she stepped back from the door. Mike, she said. Whatever these people have told you, I think we should speak privately. Mike took the bank transfer out of the folder and placed it on the entry table. Margaret glanced at it. The LLC handled dozens of transactions. A single wire transfer taken out of context proves nothing. Mike placed the email chain beside it. Margaret picked it up. Read it. Set it down. These emails are incomplete. They're from a chain that has clearly been edited. Out of context, they're easy to misread. Mike stepped to one side. Ray Cooper stepped forward. For the first time in the confrontation, something happened to Margaret's composure that was not a recalculation. It was a stillness, a very specific, very cold stillness, the stillness of someone who has just seen the one thing they had decided was not possible. "He's a convicted criminal," Margaret said. Her voice was level. Completely level. "His testimony carries no legal weight in this state. Anything he claims can be challenged and dismissed before it reaches a courtroom." Gerald stepped forward and placed the property deed on the table beside the emails. "The storage unit in Memphis," Gerald said. "Hargrove Legacy Group LLC. Your registered name. Do you want to tell us what was in it, or should we let the discovery process do that?" Margaret looked at the property deed. She looked at the four people standing in her foyer. She looked at Evelyn, who had not spoken once since she walked through the door, who had been standing slightly to the left of Mike with her hands still at her sides, watching Margaret with the calm of someone who has waited 8 years for this specific morning and has no need to fill it with words. Margaret sat down. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it had always been. Not raised. Not broken. The same practiced, level, perfectly controlled voice that had delivered every verdict of her life in the same register, from the trivial to the monstrous. "I did it," she said. "Everything. The offer she refused. The man I hired. The car. The fire. The $1,000. I arranged all of it and I was present for all of it. I would not have trusted something this important to anyone else entirely." She paused. "She was not who you thought she was, Mike. She was calculating and she was strategic and she was never interested in you, she was interested in what you were going to become. I saw it from the beginning. You were not capable of seeing it because you were in love, and love is a specific kind of blindness that I have never had the luxury of indulging. I did what was necessary to protect you and this family, and I would make every single one of those decisions again." The room was quiet for 30 seconds. Not the quiet of processing. The quiet of everyone in that room understanding simultaneously that they were standing in front of someone who had done something irreversible and monstrous and had not, at any point, understood it as either of those things. Mike looked at his mother for a long time. Then he placed the legal agreement on the table. Full financial restitution to Evelyn. The surrender of any claim over the trust distribution. A sworn, notarized statement acknowledging the staged death and Margaret's full involvement, to be held by Gerald Brooks and Mike's attorney and released to law enforcement at Mike's discretion if any future action was ever taken against Evelyn. Margaret read it slowly, looking for gaps. There were no gaps. Mike had made sure of that. She looked up. "And if I don't sign?" "Then Ray Cooper speaks to the district attorney's office this afternoon," Mike said. "And everything on that table goes with him." She picked up the pen. She signed. Mike collected the documents. He held the door open. One by one, the four of them walked out. Margaret sat alone in her foyer with the signed agreement on the table in front of her and the door closed and the house entirely silent. The house that was 12,000 square feet and had been built to communicate permanence and authority to anyone who approached it. She sat in it alone. Not in handcuffs. Not publicly shamed beyond this morning. Not destroyed. Just small. In a space that had been built to make her feel large. And that smallness was not going anywhere. The world she had spent 40 years building, the version of events in which she was the careful protector, the devoted mother, the woman who did what was necessary, that world was gone. She had signed her name to the end of it. She was simply alone in a perfect house. And she knew it. If this story has reached somewhere in you, share it with one person before this video ends. You know who needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is exactly why the channel exists. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Because the next few minutes are the part that stays with you long after this video ends. That evening, Mike came back to the farmhouse. Evelyn had made dinner. Not because she was performing domesticity or because anything between them was resolved or simple, but because it was dinner time and Lucas was home from school and Lucas needed to eat, and making food was one of the things she knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. They ate together at the kitchen table. 3 people who had never sat at a table together before, in a house that belonged to all of them in ways that hadn't been spoken yet. Lucas ate quickly, the way 8-year-olds eat when they are not particularly interested in the eating part and are using the meal as the price of admission to whatever comes after. He watched Mike the way he had been watching Mike since yesterday morning, with the specific, careful attention of a child who is trying to figure out what category to put something in and has not found the right one yet. After dinner, Evelyn cleared the plates. Mike looked at Lucas across the table. He said, "I need to tell you something. And I need to tell it to you straight because you're old enough to hear the truth and I'm not going to talk to you like you aren't." Lucas put his fork down. Mike told him. He used simple words, not because Lucas wasn't smart enough for complicated ones, but because the truth itself was simple and dressing it up would have been a disservice to both of them. He said, "I am your father. I did not know you existed until yesterday. The reason I didn't know is a long story and you will get all of it when you are ready for all of it, but the important part is this: I am here now. And I am not going anywhere." Lucas listened to all of it. He sat very still in the way that children sit still when they are doing serious thinking, not inattentive, the opposite, completely present, processing at full capacity. When Mike finished, the kitchen was quiet. Then Lucas looked at him and said, "If you're my dad, why didn't you come find me?" Mike could have given him the complicated answer. The documented answer. The answer that involved Margaret and the field in Memphis and Ray Cooper and all of the machinery that had separated them. He had the answer. He gave him the true one instead. "Because I didn't know you were here," he said. "Someone made sure I didn't know. And that is something I am going to spend a very long time being sorry about." Lucas thought about this. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked back at Mike. "Okay," he said. "One word. The word of a child who has decided to accept an imperfect truth because it is at least true, because honesty without tidiness is still honesty and is worth more than the polished version of a lie." Then he said, "Can I call you Mike for a while? I need to think about the other thing." Mike said yes. His voice held. His face held. And anyone watching would have seen a man receiving something enormous and being very careful not to drop it. Let me tell you what Mike missed. 8 years. The first steps Lucas took, in a boarding house in Louisville at 11 months old, across a kitchen floor while Evelyn held her breath. The first word, mama, then light, then no, in that order, because no is always third. The first day of school, Lucas in a backpack slightly too big for him, turning around at the door of the classroom to check that Evelyn was still there. The first nightmare, the first fever, the first friend, the first time he read a full sentence out loud and looked up with the specific luminous pride of someone who has just understood that words are a door you can open whenever you need to. All of it gone. Not reachable. Not recoverable. Named plainly, without drama, because plain truth lands harder than performance. Those years are gone. Mike will carry that. Evelyn will carry it. Lucas, in time, when he is old enough to understand the full shape of what was arranged against his family, Lucas will carry his own version of it. That is the part of justice that stories like this one don't always say out loud. That the reckoning comes. That the truth gets out. That the person who did it signs her name to what she did and sits alone in a house built for an audience she no longer has. And that it is still not enough to give back what was taken. Both things are true simultaneously. The justice is real. The loss is real. And living inside both of those truths at once, without letting either one cancel the other out, is the specific difficult work that begins after the story ends. The next morning, Lucas found an old basketball in the garage. It was flat, had been flat for years, sitting in the corner behind a rusted bicycle and a box of Christmas decorations nobody had opened since Mike was 12. But Lucas brought it outside anyway, and he bounced it on the driveway once and then carried it to where Mike was sitting on the porch steps drinking coffee. Lucas held it out. "Will you teach me?" he said. "I'm not very good." Mike looked at the flat basketball. He looked at the boy holding it. He stood up. "We need to put some air in it first," he said. "Come on. Let's find a pump." They went into the garage together. "That is where I leave them. Not at a resolution. Not at a ceremony. In a garage, looking for a pump, a man and a boy who have everything still to learn about each other and have decided to start with something simple. Because the truth about families, the truth that this story has been building toward since the moment a door opened on a dark driveway and a man saw his wife alive, is this. Some things survive everything that was meant to destroy them. Not unchanged. Not undamaged. Not without the permanent mark of what was done to them. But alive. And sometimes, if you are honest enough to start at the beginning, with a flat basketball and a garage and a kid who needs someone to show him something, that is enough. That is exactly enough. If this story moved you, and I believe it did, because you are still here, share it with one person right now. You already know who that person is. You thought of them during this story. Send it to them. They will know why. Subscribe if you are not already here. Hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. And leave me a comment below. I want to know, at what point in this story did you feel it the most? Was it the field in Memphis? The boy's green eyes? The signed agreement? The basketball in the garage? Tell me. Because stories like this one exist for exactly that reason, to give back the moment that someone tried to take. Until next time. Some things survive. Remember that.